the beginning of Extinction Rebellion really came out of another movement called Rising Up. It was a decentralized network of groups across the UK focusing on the different pillars of the sort of toxic system, as we called it, the toxic finance system, toxic media, and the lack of democracy within the UK. So it was kind of had a disparate number of groups that really felt the values around decentralization and autonomy, but they weren't very cohesive with each other. They were all keen on civil disobedience, but weren't working towards a sort of common goal. So what Extinction Rebellion did was, Roger at the beginning of last year put a paper towards the rest of everyone else in Rising Up and said, look, I think we need to pivot to the major issue, which is the climate breakdown and ecological collapse. And by doing that, he kind of brought the whole network together, and we sort of decided together that we wanted to start something different, and we wanted to start a rebellion, and that's quite grand. And it's one of these things about asking for something big. It's saying in the face of something huge, we need to talk about big changes, basically. So through that, we kind of came together. It started out with maybe 12 people in a cafe in Bristol about a year ago, where I'm based right now, split into small working groups. How are we going to do media? How are we going to do outreach? And from there, really grew over the summer of last year with a really quite old-fashioned organizing model, which is essentially kind of 19th century-esque, which is going to town halls and giving a talk and kind of inviting the local community through a public speech to come along and share what they feel about the crisis and open up a space for grief around that. And that really, I think, opened the floodgates for what people were really feeling. There's a lot of this kind of silence that goes around the climate movement, suffering in silence about what you know is coming, and you feel frustrated by, you feel terrified about, but you can't do anything about it. So Extinction Rebellion really opened that, I think, for a lot of people. And as soon as we started putting that into action, we did our first actions sort of October last year, blocking streets in London, blocking the bridges, that then allow for this kind of more cultural space of civil disobedience, okay, or it's something we can start to think about within our sort of, within our groups, something we can start to do to challenge the climate crisis, which wasn't being so openly done beforehand, this kind of, open disobedience. So that really then brought on another massive part of the movement. We doubled in size in terms of, membership and or email lists, at least after that rebellion. And got a lot of crowdfunding donations, average of like £20, 100,000, 200,000 pounds, just from blocking those bridges, because people realised the potential of what this could be. And then since between then, in November and April, it was just an effort of mobilising back into those communities, helping build the networks, and saying, look, let's go for something big. We had this big juggling act of, okay, well, should we do one site in London again? Should we try and block one major area, or should we do 4? And it was just like, well, what do we go for? And I kind of crunched the numbers a couple of weeks beforehand about people pledging to take a week off work, people pledging to get arrested, and it was looking like 2,000 people. And we thought, well, there are 2,000 people that are replying to our emails saying they're going to get arrested and pledging to take the week off work. Then there are going to be even more than that coming. So let's do all 4 locations. And then through that ambition, we kind of opened up to this international rebellion where we, blocked London for a week and a half. Unprecedented modern civil disobedience in the UK. Really spectacular to see, and the results of it we're still seeing. We had a meeting with the government, with the environmental secretary, and now Theresa May in the UK has just announced that they're setting a new carbon zero target 2050. So what we're kind of seeing is the effects of what Extinction Rebellion and the climate strikes are kicking into public consciousness.
And so, take us back to the International Week of Rebellion too. So, during that week, I'm based in the U.S., so we got a little glimpse of it, but not as much, I think, as obviously someone in Europe. So, how many people were arrested? What was the feeling? What was it like? Where were you? Were you also on the bridge, or tell us about your experience and
yeah,
overall?
Sure. So my experience of it is probably less exciting than lots of other people's because of one of these organizer capacities. I was mainly in the office trying to pull everything together from the background. But one of the things they did do, which was amazing to see, was this kind of really liberating moment of when we first took Marble Arch, a key site in London. I was helping the Lewisham, South London, where I'm from, affinity group, take one of the streets, and then we had like 4 other groups take the streets at the same time. And as we took the street, we had a truck that drove through, kind of let the truck through because we knew it was our truck. They parked up, blocked another road, and set up a stage right there and then with about 10 Christian activists locked onto it. So we knew it wasn't going anywhere, basically. And the thing that was amazing about that was that just like the police's reaction was just, all right, let's just let it happen. They're so inclined towards the order of the situation. They need to see how it's panning out first before they decide to do anything. So for the whole first day, basically, there were no arrests whatsoever. We just blocked these 5 locations actually at first, and just allowed it to happen. And I mean, allowed everything to happen. Like as soon as we took those roads, there were these kids. I loved it. There were these kids that took their spray cans and just sprayed the symbol, the XR symbol, on the roads straight away, and it kind of really released this like feeling of civil disobedience. Just allowed it out into the open, really public way. So I kind of helped take some of the first locations, and then the rest of the rebellion, I was really focusing on trying to help build communication systems. So we've got this classic thing, right, which is like, you want to make decisions as a movement, but you don't want to be top down, but at the same time you can't be like totally everyone the same voice type thing, or else nothing gets decided and it takes forever. So it was really helping to kind of build a sort of spokes council communication system that allowed that to flow, because that was one of the frustrations a lot of people had, was like, how do we communicate with what we're feeling and what's happening? So facilitating people's assemblies, allowing that process to happen. And then once that kind of communication was better set up, focused on pressure building actions. So, it's cool to take those 4 sites, and there are about 1,100 people arrested overall for just holding those sites, which is really amazing to see people's commitment really solidify during that period of time. We have our affinity groups, but this was something on a different level. It was, having a place that you hold, which I'm sure, from Occupy, that similar, like, this is a territorial thing. It's kind of like an instinct. And then there was things like having an object. So we had a pink boat in Oxford Circus that really like united everyone around it, and everyone chanting things like, "We are the boat," really kind of having this identity association with the place and of the protest. And so these sites were kind of holding the ground and creating a lot of attention. But what I was focusing on more was, how do we build pressure during this period of time? So we've got all these people who are willing to do more than just block roads. So I was sort of planning out how we were going to try and disrupt London's transport systems. So we had a plan to really block every major line in the city, and we were very close to going ahead with it, but we just did the one line in the end, the DLR line, which got several activists imprisoned for 2 weeks, which again released this kind of like, wow, they can do that. Old guy, Phil, 84 years old, sitting on top of a train, eating a sandwich, saying, I'm not gonna, this is what I need to do to protect my grandchildren. Really powerful stuff that came out of it, in terms of the kind of coverage and this empowerment feeling. We can do this.
So one thing that you mentioned is interesting. I mean, in the first days of Occupy, it was also similar how the police kind of like let it happen. So I'm curious about your reflections on like, why do you think that the police kind of, like, most people would assume, oh, you're going to block some traffic, they'll be out there really hardcore and like get you, why do you think they let it kind of like start without arrest like that?
Yeah, I think it's because one of the things we do in Extinction Rebellion is we actually speak to the police quite regularly. We go meet with them. I met with the commander of the Bristol Police just last week about, how the protests are going and how, actually they weren't policing it very well. It's quite an interesting conversation, saying, look, you're not guarding people's safety very well here. And he said, okay, fair enough. And some of the police that came over to our protest had just come from policing a far right protest. And they were treating Extinction Rebellion activists in the same way they're treating those people. And I was saying, no, that's not cool. We're non-violent. We're a completely different way of doing things. And through having that conversation, he said, okay, well, you can come and do a talk for the police about Extinction Rebellion and what you guys are doing. And I was like, fantastic. That's exactly, what we need. Is from looking at the research, that Erica Chenoweth did, this 3.5% figure, one of the major factors she mentions in the success of nonviolent movements is the loyalty shifts within the security forces. 60% more likely to succeed if you secure loyalty shifts. So we make an active effort to kind of, what's called in those books fraternization or whatever, but really it's just getting along with police, and it doesn't have to be a whole male thing. And it's just an opening up that dialogue, because a lot of them are in the same boat. Excuse me. They're in the same boat of, being fucked off with the government and being cut and all this kind of stuff. And they've got kids too, right? So we kind of open up with that dialogue. So that's something I've been doing for a long time, especially with the Met in London. So before the sites were taken, they knew that was happening basically, but in the same way they wanted to kind of, one of their big things about order and understanding, so they want to see exactly what the situation is before they act on it. They don't want to preempt it and then have the whole backfiring effect of looking too heavy-handed on what was, for everyone around could see was like mainly families and kids and like a big number of people, especially on the first few days. So they waited until nighttime basically, or when the kind of numbers dropped a bit before they would start doing more mass arrests. And the most powerful thing was to see, that they couldn't do it. They couldn't arrest all the people on the bridge or on one of the sites because there were too many of us, and people who were just saying, and we kind of worked out quite quickly that they could only sort of arrest 100 or 200 people per day. And they kept at that rate over every day, and they couldn't get away at it. So it was only after a week and a half they really started to break through the lines. But I think that's what they were trying to do initially, is just try and scope out what's the situation, how can we do this? And they said it in their police statements, right? This is it's nothing they'd ever dealt with before. They didn't know how to deal with a pink boat in Oxford Circus. It's not in the training.
That's interesting, this question of fraternization, which I think is really, it's true. It's one of the ways in which revolutionaries have succeeded. So I'm curious though, like how does your movement basically determine how transparent to be? Because one of the problems I think within the American environmentalist movement is they not only fraternize with the police, but they just like passively get arrested. Like everything's just like a spectacle, which is what it didn't feel like XR was doing that. Actually, I'm surprised to know how much communication was going on behind the scenes, because it still felt like there was this, not just like giving in. So how do you maintain that balance between communicating with the police? Is there some elements that you keep secret, or do you basically just say like, well, this, like, we're still going to not allow ourselves to be arrested, but we will tell you that we are here? Or like, how do you make that balance?
Yeah, so I guess, we have elements that are still closed. So within affinity groups, within the people who are organizing actions, they'll still, not give details. Like we didn't tell them there's going to be a truck, for example, to be blocking those roads, and different elements of the design. But I think one of the things we do communicate is in a sort of like, in a respectful and peaceful way, just stating, look, we're going to go and sit on those roads, and, and if you've got to arrest us, well, that's cool, because that's your job. But we're going to sit there all the same because we really care about this. This is what we think is going to make the change. And so, we're doing our thing because that's what we believe in. You do your thing because that's what your job is. And there's this kind of like a little bit of respect that goes on for that, of like just understanding where each other is coming from. That we kind of try and use to sort of open a line of communication and say, look, we're kind of in this together, right? And we saw a lot of that happening. Police that would come up to us during the protest to talk about how much they cared about these issues, or even this now much grown network of ex-police officers who are now part of Extinction Rebellion and are helping to do the police liaison work about how we go and talk in police stations with police communities about what the crisis, because people too, right? The police are unjust in many ways in the UK as a structural system, but it's recognizing the kind of human elements to the police and how we can engage with that, and how that is a key part to what holds up the power. It's a key pillar of the state power. And moving into the autumn for our next rebellion, we're looking at a much larger number of people out on the streets. We're hoping for more like 10,000 arrests. So it's at what point can the state allow that to happen? and to continue? And at what point do they say, okay, now it's time to crack down in the same way they might have done in France, for example, tear gas, this kind of thing? And to have built this relationship with the police beforehand, to be able to know them and look at them in the eyes and say, Wayne, what are you doing? Why are you tear gassing peaceful protesters? Then that makes a big difference, I think, or at least that's the theory. Just got to try it out.
Okay, and one more question before I move on to the present, but I'm curious, why did the rebellion stop? How did that debate go within the movement to decide, we're going to take a pause and that kind of stuff?
Yeah, so that was an interesting one. I mean, partly it was forced by the number of arrests and how people were not planning on. Lots of people were planning on staying for a week, and to stay for a week and a half. There were growing numbers of people who were joining, but the people who were there initially were obviously morted, and people who had been planning for this for months, basically. So we kind of lost some of the key people through that process. There were also people, once they'd been arrested twice, they would start holding them for even longer, which made it harder for them to get back on the streets, harder to hold the lines. So that kind of tactical element was quite tricky. And the police also, at that point, about after the first week, they'd worked out how to remove the major infrastructure that was holding the camps together. So things like the pink boat, like the trucks. They worked out a way of kettling around those objects, arresting everyone within inside the kettle, and then towing the objects away. And just losing those lost it was a really big part of people's commitment to the spaces and stuff, was having being able to see there's a stage or the pink boat was there. Otherwise, everyone's just sitting in a row without something kind of uniting them as much. So those kind of factors built into it. And then I think that there was also, with the camp in particular, in Marble Arch, one of the last ones to be left over, there was this kind of growing number of people who were just there for a good time type thing, people who were just there for the music to kind of relax out in the sunshine. It was hot days, basically, and they just wanted to use that as a free space to crash. And a growing number of those kind of people who weren't, who didn't have the Extinction Rebellion culture in the same way. No drinks, no alcohol. We don't talk over each other in meetings. That culture wasn't there, and that's a really key part of who we are. So once that increase in those kind of people who are coming along, and a decrease in the people who are high capacity, high skilled within XR, meant that we thought, this isn't the camp that we want anymore. And we kind of put it out to the people at People's Assembly and said, look, do you think we should be leaving from the camp and going back into our communities? And overwhelmingly people said yes. So we then took it to an anchor circle, a meeting, kind of the widest circle within XR, and said, look, this is the call we need to go for. Let's move people out. But in a way that it's a kind of interesting thing that we came across during the rebellion, was this idea of a graceful exit. So with the boat, for example, being towed away, there was this because in the evening, it was really warm night. There was this kind of animosity that was building between people and the police. And it was really building up. People no, we have to protect the boat at every cost we can, everything, all this really strong emotion that was going towards it, which actually led to the closest thing we had to violence within the whole rebellion, right? Because there was just such high emotions, and we had people like Roger and Gail and others go down to kind of cool things and just say, look, we can let go of the boat. It's okay. We're going to be back, and we're going to be sitting in the roads, and we're going to be peaceful, and it's fine to say we can let go of things. So again, with the rebellion, we said, okay, we can let go of this space now. We've done our part. We don't want to be burnt out sitting around here in the centre of London any longer. So through that, we sort of said, okay, let's end it here, and as part of that, have a closing ceremony, which was really beautiful. Thousands people come along, and we had speakers from lots of different faith groups to kind of welcome everyone into that space, and really appreciate what we did and feel present as part of it, and kind of give a goodbye. And that felt like a really good way to end it, I think. Cool. I mean, complete chaos behind the scenes, but that's what it looked like in the front ground anyway.
Right. Cool. Yeah, I mean, I think in many ways, what I love about XR is it's definitely a movement that feels like it's learned from previous movements, which is one of the problems with, for a while, it felt like no one was learning from previous movements. And one of the ways in which I feel like XR is learning is this whole question of like, can there be a time in which to have a graceful exit, as you put it, which is definitely Occupy wasn't able to do that. And the great irony of Occupy is that at Adbusters, when we put out the email basically saying maybe it's time for a graceful exit, we called it more like a, return in the spring kind of thing. That day is when they evicted everyone. So it's like, in a way, we waited too long and also it's like, if you wait too long, eventually you will be removed in this weird sense. And I think that because the International Rebellion, because you left on your own terms, like it still exists. Of course, that brings us into this present moment, which is this question of there is this it does leave open this whole question of the ability to return and how will it return differently. But I guess I'm curious about, so if we focus on the present, what are some of the kind of internal debates or struggles that have emerged within XR that maybe didn't exist before the International Rebellion? So what are some of the ways in which the International Rebellion has changed the culture of XR and the debates that have emerged now?
Yeah, so it's that first word base. It's the international element that's become a lot more emergent and difficult. It's been very difficult helping to organize on a sort of international basis or an international layer, because we do have a structure of decision making within the UK, and we have that, like I mentioned, this anchor circle layer which helps to hold the purpose of Extinction Rebellion UK. But obviously you now have we have groups in 50 countries, of which many of them have grown substantially over the last few months. So Germany, for example, has over 30 groups now and has a really strong Extinction Rebellion culture. And so it was no longer a case of XR UK dictating the way that things went. There's a whole other movements that have grown within Extinction Rebellion that now need to have their voice heard, and especially global South majority world voices. How are they going to be heard within this movement? And what we kind of faced immediately was that we didn't have an international structure, and this kind of left us in a vacuum of how do we make decisions internationally when we don't have that structure. It's what we call I work in the self-organizing system team, part of our autonomy and post-consensus structure design, and it's what we call the tyranny of structurelessness. Who decides in that instance? And that's been really difficult. It's ongoing, and it's kind of caused quite a lot of high emotions about who's involved and in what way are global South voices involved, in what way are global North voices dominating this process, and is it just the UK dictating again how we do this kind of structure? So that's been a big topic every week actually since the rebellion, it's totally necessary to work out, right? Because the climate crisis is not just a UK issue; it's an international issue. So if we're going to deal with it, we need to deal with it in this international way. So building on that has been difficult. The other thing has been around how we build pressure over the summer, with actions that aren't the real deal in the same way that the rebellion is, but do maintain Extinction Rebellion presence and pressure on the government. One of these is around blocking Heathrow, flying drones in the area of the airport to shut it down. And this was a big and contentious thing within the movement. Lots of people didn't understand, what the notion of the action was. Initially, when it was put out, they thought it was flying drones around airport airspace rather than just in the local area, which would still cause it to shut down. So people thought it was becoming something different than what XR was, and that caused a lot of tension within the movement. And it's looking at that. It's been about how do we communicate clearly that we are based on autonomy and decentralization, so that it's not this homogenous XR that makes a decision about doing drones. It's like there is an action group within Extinction Rebellion that is going to do this action, right, or wants to do this action. But how do you frame that in a way that isn't just it's XR doing it or XR UK? So those kind of questions about how we represent decentralized groups within the movement is quite difficult, and it's hard to explain that way of thinking, which is so not prevalent in our culture.
And what are some of the, I'm curious about this. So you have these different international groups now emerging within XR. So what would, just in general terms, what would you say are some of the kind of cultural differences that have emerged in some of the, so like how does XR Germany, how do you see the culture of XR Germany different from XR UK? And what are some of the other kind of like cultural differences that are emerging within XR?
Yeah, so that's a good point. So a big part of it is obviously, so like that, let's take that what I was talking about earlier as a good example, the security, how we interact with the security forces, for example. In the UK, we do it in quite open way. And that's picked on in a couple of other countries, but a couple of other countries are super against that, that kind of way of interacting with the police because there's a different culture there and there's much more fear around how that works. And so that's something that they would not do in their cultures. There's also just a much bigger security culture in general. So in the UK, we do lots of things organizing through consumer platforms like Google, super easy, Google Docs, sharing and easy people to use. Whereas in other countries, there's a much stronger security culture around not using Google, especially in Brazil or other countries where they feel that threat a lot more closely. So yeah, kind of working between those two cultures has been quite difficult at times, quite contentious. But we're now moving, at least from this tech perspective, into a kind of international organizing platform, so that it is all a secure server, people can feel more comfortable organizing with XR in that way. But yeah, kind of getting through those different elements of the culture has been quite difficult. I think even communicating the principles and values in their deepest sense has been hard, because people have set up these groups often from a more sort of radical spectrum or whatever. They've kind of come up and they've just said, oh, this is the thing we should be doing, but they haven't really looked into the principles and values and what they mean. So things like a regenerative culture, for example, I haven't seen that in many of the international groups in terms of putting a focus towards that, in terms, not just saying, we're about action, 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 but saying we're also about how we look after ourselves and how we hold our emotions around the collapse. So and observing things around that has been really useful for thinking about how we do our DNA communication work. So this is something that when we spoke to Paul Engler, who wrote This Is an Uprising about before the rebellion, he said this is the key thing that's going to fracture your movement, is if you don't communicate your DNA well, and if you don't communicate your story, your strategy, your structure, you're going to have different elements of it that will splinter off, because that's not embedded in what they're doing. So that's been a key piece of work, I think, for now, is working on how we communicate our DNA and building you'd like this actually, a course, a Rebel University type course to kind of bring people into that culture in a similar way. With your videos, you can explain to people about how activist culture has changed and what we've learned from it. And this is a kind of similar learning with XR.
Cool. Okay, so let's go now into the future. So let's see. I'm curious about. Let's start with questions about how. Let's just say, like, first, generally speaking, where do you think XR is going? So you've already hinted a little bit, but where is XR going in the next few months or more?
Yeah, so I think that's the thing I've been thinking about a lot recently, is how we combine our strategies with things that have been done previously. So something I've been really working on a lot is I coordinate the communities team within XR, so focusing on how we build a volunteer network, how we build local groups, how we build affinity groups. And I've been really learning so much from the Bernie Sanders campaign in the States about how they built, this 100,000 volunteers, and we're starting to create similar structures to that. And I've actually been speaking to Becky Bond and other people who wrote this, how big organizing works documents, and it's been fantastic learning all that stuff, because then we can then use it not just for like some political campaign, but to build towards civil disobedience, which is putting it into a whole different framework in my mind, and something they kind of experimented on, I think, with around the Dakota Access Pipeline, pledging people to get arrested. And I think there's so much more potential in that we can work on. So I've got this, this kind of combination of big organizing, of civil disobedience, and then the third thing is the political strategy, which is about citizens' assemblies. So how can we use two elements to really push for this one goal? and we're kind of looking at different angles in which that can be used. So one example we're thinking about in Bristol at the moment is how we could use a kind of phone banking local system to be able to encourage people to pledge to do a tax strike, and using the money they withhold. Maybe you start off with like 10% of local council tax and putting it towards a citizens' assembly in your local area. And that way, even if the government, and we're saying, we're doing that until the government gives in and, creates a citizens' assembly locally. So, and either way, you've won basically, because either way, they're gonna create a citizens' assembly because, we've put so much pressure on and they're losing a lot of money and they can't charge everyone who's been doing it because it's too much paperwork, 1,000 people, whatever. Or they don't do it and they allow us to create a citizens' assembly with the funding that we make, and then we use that as a kind of dual power structure in the local area. That citizens' assembly that we make decides that we can't have an airport expansion because it's suicidal. Well, let's go do massive disobedience outside their airport, and we're listening to the will of the people in doing that. So it's a really interesting combining those, and it can be done with, that's just an example, but it can be done with different elements, right? To put real pressure onto the government. So that's something I'm quite interested in over the summer, is how we communicate that strategy to people. We're kind of planning a tour at the moment of the UK about how we get this message across, and then putting that into a period of action. So having discussions around the strategy at each of these tour meetings, and at the end having an opportunity to sort of sign up to pledge to get arrested or go to prison. And now, and then using that again to the Heathrow action, I think, is being delayed probably until September time. So let's make that into something a lot bigger. So we're looking at maybe getting 400 people into prison as part of that action, and then saying, we're at 400 parts per million of carbon, 410 parts per million of carbon in the atmosphere, and it's murderous, right? So this is why 400 people are going to prison, and linking that to the stopping of fossil fuel infrastructure. So that's the kind of plan for the summer, I think, is experimenting with those different methods and how they can be combined. And then really then using that mobilization to focus on the next rebellion, which it looks like will be starting on the 7th of October, and maybe going up to a month this time in terms of length. And really building on the wave of actions that will be happening across Europe around that time, across the world. You've got the climate strikes on the 20th and 27th of September. We've got Earth Strike on the 27th of September, and building from that energy and starting 10, 20,000 people in London blocking the roads. And the thing that's been really exciting me about this when I do my communities work is we're now building communities within the Extinction Rebellion of different community backgrounds. So Extinction Rebellion Muslims, Extinction Rebellion Jews, Extinction Rebellion lawyers, nurses, all these different community interest groups, and starting to build towards a kind of movement of movements framing, where we've got activists in different groups that have got demands of the government, and realize that the civil disobedience framework is a perfect way to do it. So we've got this idea that come October we're going to have a roundabout that's just blocked by vegans, and another one that's done by Christians, and a bridge that's done by black rights activists, and this kind of thing, right? So helping to build a kind of a movement of movements where we take the city together and really push for the citizens' assembly demand. So that's I'm looking forward to how that pans out.
That's very interesting. I think it's interesting how I like that last part about how you're using kind of identity to unite this movement in a weird way. So you'd have, how you have different identities protesting, but then they're all pushing towards this, the Extinction Rebellion. So briefly, can you explain, so it sounds like a lot of the future, at least for you, thinking about XR is pushing towards the citizen assembly part of the demand. So just briefly explain, I'm curious about your thinking about the citizen assembly, how it would become a legitimate is not the right word, but basically, if the assembly is just people who have all signed up that they love XR, that doesn't mean it's an actual representative of the community. So how do you get around that kind of problem? I know you've been thinking about sortition and stuff. So I'm just curious about what is the assembly and how do you ground its sovereignty, and so it's such that it can say things like our community doesn't want the extension of Heathrow, therefore we have the right to stop it.
Yeah, so I think we're looking at different examples of citizens' assembly at the moment, but the main focus is around the national citizens' assembly, which would be involving ordinary people from the UK public. Probably most of them wouldn't even be part of Extinction Rebellion because they just, it's decided by petition, like you mentioned, so randomly selected across the UK and then sort of stratified based on whether or not they represent certain groups within the population. So, 13% in the UK, at least, from a black or brown background. And then you have, more people from a lower income background than is currently represented by the kind of system. So you'd kind of stratify based on these different demographics, and then those people would come together and over a period of weeks, deliberating, make the decisions about the policy going forward. So it wouldn't be XR doing that, it'd be kind of independently facilitated in that process, in the same way that the Citizens' Assembly has done in Ireland around the abortion issue. But it would be done in a way that wasn't like in Ireland, where it was kind of like a suggestion. It would be like, this is this is what we're going for, in a way, and that this would be the power basically around in the UK. And I think that could be quite a scary change for a lot of people, and then the UK hasn't really experienced a sort of revolutionary change like that for a long period of time. So we've got this sort of idea, which is to help keep the traditional elements. I think I mentioned it last time on the call of like in Porto Alegre, they have participatory budgeting systems where the government basically rubber stamps it after each time, because they know that if they didn't rubber stamp it, there'd be uproar about not listening to the people. So going for a sort of similar system here, where we're not saying, bring down the Queen or anything like that. We're just saying that this assembly needs to be, built and constituted. We need to listen to what these people are saying, and then we're going to, make sure that those are acted upon. So that's one element of the Citizens' Assembly is moving towards that more revolutionary framework of changing the actual power structures within the UK. And then the other element of the Citizens' Assembly we're going to try and use is around this tyranny of structurelessness. So how do we decide within Extinction Rebellion how to move forward with our structures? Is it the same old, people in the anchor circle decide everything? Well, we're going to look at trying to create a Citizens' Assembly of people within XR to make the decision about how these strategies go forward, and kind of give that democratic element of movement as well as towards our demands.
Okay, so for this October 7th action, what are some of the ways in which, we know that the police they learn better than anyone else, right? So they're probably already training for diffusing the same tactics that were used in the last round. So I guess, it's not possible to disclose how you want to be different, but I guess I'm curious about, you're just the internal thinking around this challenge. Obviously, if you come back in the exact same way, it's probably going to fizzle. How do you, how do you get the movement to act differently? Like, I don't know, how are you addressing this challenge?
Yeah, it's a good question. I'm not part of the actions team, so I haven't done much thinking about this already, but I've got my own sort of general thoughts, which are that there's a greater element of the movement that will be focusing on higher levels of civil disobedience, which would involve fewer people probably being involved, but causing larger levels of disruption and leading to higher sentences and prison and this kind of thing. What we found very quickly that we could fill up the cells in London. We found out there were like 900 cells, and then after that they had to start shipping people out to local towns and cities, which is a bit of a political nightmare in the first place, because the regional police are not a big fan of the London police. So when they said, oh yeah, we need to take our prisoners as well, they were not happy about it. Looking at how we can increase those numbers, I think, is key, and get to a point of they can't take any more. Using higher levels of civil disobedience and blocking public transport and major public infrastructure to kind of really start to grind the city to a halt. And the kind of framing, the messaging we're using around this, or I think we are at least, is around London needs to come to a standstill, to have a pause. People in London, heart of power in the UK, need to take a pause and reflect and think about the situation that we are facing right now. and the despair that comes with that pause needs to be communicated, and the emergency needs to be communicated in a sort of World War II type fashion. And so I think having these pockets of people who are up for doing high levels of civil disobedience will allow for a greater amount of process to take place, and hopefully we can try out new methods about how this disruption will take place, and hopefully expand from the 5 locations across into more in the city, and maybe target more things than just roads. I've got this idea about having like a barge party blocking the Thames or something like that.
Cool. And I want to leave time for questions, but the last thing I'm thinking about is, like whenever we engage as activists in civil disobedience, inevitably the people most impacted by our disruptions are the people who are like trying to get to work because they have a minimum wage job. And so there's this tension between alienating the public, respectability, and militancy. And, I personally, I don't care about alienating the public, but I'm curious about how this plays out, because a lot of the disruptive behaviors that we're able to do disproportionately impact the people who are ostensibly trying to get onto our side. So how does this kind of, how have you, I guess this maybe played out a little bit in the International Rebellion, but I'm curious, how do you address this challenge,
Yeah, no, it definitely did play out in the rebellion. In fact, one of the last day of action we did was targeting the financial district, because that was seen as a much more movement boosting morale action for lots of people, because lots of people felt, we don't want to alienate the public, we don't want to block more streets in London, we want to target the big banks and this kind of thing. And that's definitely got merit, and it did hit a lot of important banks pretty hard. The fact that we kind of blocked all their streets around them for a while, that was good for morale. But similar to you, I think that actually I say that targeting the public is key to XR's strategy, because it's the public that are going to make the difference about how this is decided. It's that 3.5% of people that we need in active support is going to come from the public, and it's that public consciousness around the issue that's going to really frame how we move forward. And I think there was a lot of concern and worry that we had some polls that came out during the rebellion saying how much the public support XR, how much they support their aims or demands, and there was sort of 60% that supported the aims and demands of XR, but I think general public support for the movement was just below 50%. People were worrying, they're going, oh no, this is it, we can't, we've got to do more things that are going to please the public and keep them on side. And we were just going, and me, I was just going, no, that's not how it works. Martin Luther King, like most hated man in the early 60s, it's not because, you just got to, there's this thing I think is really powerful, which is the first demand about telling the truth and just speaking your truth, and knowing that it's right and that it's to do so, and sticking with that, even if it means dropping lower in the public support. I think once you get below sort of 30%, you need to start thinking a lot more critically, strategically about what you're doing. But around 40, 50, I think we're still fine. And thinking about how we are affecting those communities. It was great during the rebellion to hear all these stories about local communities that would actually come out and say thank you. Thank you for stopping the traffic that's causing so much air pollution around my town, or thank you for coming out and allowing for quiet. And it was amazing. Central streets of London completely silent in the first in the hours of the morning, because we just held it. And using some of those stories to really express how people are feeling locally. Some of the other ways you do is de-escalation. So we are blocking roads or whatever. We speak to the public who we're there with. We say we're so sorry about the disruption. We often offer treats, little cakes and things, to kind of show that we're not doing this because we want you to have a shit day. We're doing this because people need to feel what's happening. And I think so much of these climate or social movements, whatever, have been about thinking. They've been about thinking about how we deal with this shit. It needs to be about feeling. It needs to be about the embodiment of where we're going, and releasing that, because that's what creates a real social change for me. It's not just thinking about how it's all done. It's feeling it and knowing that you can do something in a different way. So hopefully we can.
And it's really the role of children, who are in many ways the most profound truth tellers. And reflections I've been having on the profound alertness of adults to when children step forward and say enough is enough. We saw this coming out of Sweden. There have been a number of high school actions. And I think more than anyone, children have the most to say and gain from playing a more high visible public role, and are more difficult for the authorities to mistreat. So I'm just curious about this as I've taken to calling it a children's crusade, evoking an era when children really were called to duty. And so I'm putting that out there as a thought piece.
Just as a historical aside before Robin jumps in, the Children's Crusade, which I've been also researching because it's a great example, I'd love to do more writing about it. It ended in them all being enslaved. I just want to...
And is that also not a metaphor for what is yet to happen?
Okay, nice. All right, go ahead.
Yeah, no, well, youth are a key part about the movement, right, and how we build going forward. So I was talking with Micah earlier about the idea about different identities playing out in the Autumn Rebellion, taking their own spaces within London with their own demands, their own voices around what they want to be heard. And the youth are a big part of that. Actually, I've got some of the youth XR stickers right here, Extinction Rebellion Youth. I mean, they're a huge part about how we build momentum going forward, because the thing that people empathize with a lot more is young people, is older people, and women probably as well. And that helps to build the sort of public support and understanding of the movement, is going through this emotional connection with the people who are part of it. Yes. And so I think the young people play a huge part in that emotional connection, empathy, of understanding. And it kind of, as a young person as well, I'm 21, and it's like there is a huge space within my heart for rage at what this system has done to us, around the toxicity that it's created. And it's kind of, again, creating a space in which that can be let out in a non-violent, in a peaceful way, but in a way that really, empowers people to go out and do more, and to kind of cross that threshold, as they did with the Children's Crusade, of actually going out and getting arrested and going, I'm going to go out and get arrested, and he's going to go out and get arrested, and we're going to have a party in jail because, we're entering this whole different cultural situation, right, where it's like, well, let's just fuck it, we're screwed, but, let's at least enjoy it when we go out. And that kind of feeling is like palpable, I think, within young people at the moment. And it's like, how do we mobilize that, not in the way that's done with the climate strikes, where it's all sort of like one moment boom and then bust. It's like, how do we mobilize that in a structured way, which is going to lead to, the falling of elites in the society.
Mm-hmm. 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 Yes, there's also this element of my inner child, which experiences this outrage. And despite, having grown up through the environmental movement, recalling, old enough to be part of it in the late 60s and early 70s, never having found a sort of a network of networks that achieved this momentum is the only word I can speak to. Well, I'm encouraged. I did, Micah, share with you an email of how Extinction Rebellion was sort of photo quoted in Nova Scotia as part of a protest against the clear-cutting of what the government declares to be old but not old enough forests. And it's fascinating to see how these visual quotations are starting to play out. Could you maybe speak a bit more, like you held up the stickers, about how you're thinking about the sort of the visual, the visualization and the coherency around the visualization of Extinction Rebellion?
Well, okay, so we want to make sure that the young people have their own identity within the movement, right? Because that's super important, and being autonomous within that identity to do what they want to do. So what I got here is the young voice of the rebellion, and kind of saying that there is a separate voice within this rebellion that wants to be heard, wants to be listened to, and they do their own actions based on that. So they did an action at Parliament where they de-locked themselves by the neck to the gates of Parliament, and that was a really powerful image. And that then has spread to other protest movements. It's really interesting to see. There's a youth action in Berlin that happened just last week where they de-locked themselves. There was an action, and in that one, actually, they even had pictures of XR youth. They were holding them with them. And then there was an action in the Scottish Parliament where they de-locked themselves to the Parliament as well. This was older people. And then they sent the keys to the de-locks to the MPs in Parliament and then asked them to come out and release them and talk to them. And they actually did it. And the police, because it was too hard for the police to get them off, basically, so they just asked them to come out and do it. And it worked great. And then there was this animal, there's direct everywhere. They de-locked themselves to the industrial animal farming, and then they talked about Extinction Rebellion as being an inspiration. That image was super powerful, I think, to people to see, young people literally chained to power. And I think the other image which was really powerful for me, which was around, there's a previous call to disrupt Heathrow, which happened during the International Rebellion, where we got all of the world's media in the UK to Heathrow to say we're going to disrupt it. And then instead of doing that, we just had a dozen people there with a banner that said, "We are the last generation." And then they just stood there and took pictures. And it was a kind of a bit of a jiu-jitsu move where we say, we're going to do this huge thing. And then everyone comes around to gather to see what the thing is. And then it's just, 12 young people crying because, with this banner that says, "We are the last generation." And putting the focus on that was really powerful visually, I think.
Well, listen, I really want to thank you, Robin, for taking the time to talk to us. And I hope that this can be kind of an ongoing process because, my feeling about XR, I've said it before and I'll say it again. I feel like XR is the future. I think that it's the one movement out there right now that has actually incorporated all of the understandings of the movements that have come before it and has a very sophisticated way of dealing with how to create change. And I think that a lot of the movements, especially in America, that get attention are the ones that are being pushed by progressives who have, inroads with the media and stuff like that, but they just fizzle and disappear. And I don't need to quote them and all this kind of stuff. But whereas I feel like XR has a kind of lasting power. And so I think in the tension going forward that I'm excited to see you guys play out is this movement from basically disruption to power and how to actually become the force that will solve climate change. And I think XR has a really good chance at it. And so I'm just really thrilled that you're part of Actors Graduate School and that we get this chance to talk. And I wish you all the best.
Yeah, you too, Micah. I really appreciate it. Thanks so much. And thanks, David, as well. Good to meet you.
Good to meet you,
Easy.
All right.
Bye.
Bye.
Cheers, Michael.
I did.